the French president to his diplomatic corps, to all of his ambassadors. François Hollande, we're looking at his policies. This is 4 months after he was elected president, first socialist in nearly a quarter of a century to be the French leader. With us, Régis Le Sommier of French news magazine Paris Match, Luis Peral of the European Institute for Security Studies, and from Washington, Robert Zarate of the Foreign Policy Initiative think tank. Welcome back to all of you gentlemen. We were talking just before the break about the various options and how limited they were. Luis Peral, your thoughts on what the West can do now at this point, short of a no-fly zone?
I think it's time to take the responsibility. I think it's too easy to blame the opposition or to blame Russia and China because that has been done for long. But the truth is that the use of force was off the table from day one. The NATO Secretary General very early on said publicly that there would be no use of force in Syria, regardless what the regime would do. And that was somehow extending a blank check, and now we are paying for that, I should say. So it's perhaps time to think about that mistake and be able to make pressure in a clear sense.
And what does that mean?
That means the possibility of enforcing a no-fly zone or enforcing a security area for the population to have access to humanitarian aid, with or without the Security Council. And I think it's time to change our reasoning. We tend to believe that the humanitarian areas, humanitarian zones are just based or grounded on human rights law. But this is not the case. They are also a response to the violation of the sovereignty of neighboring countries. Look at the situation of Turkey now. Turkey is now under the pressure of refugees getting to the borders. So who is violating the sovereignty of whom? Is it those countries thinking of intervening in Syria, or is it Syria forcing people to flee?
Again, Régis Le Sommier, the Western powers have bypassed the Security Council before.
Yes, it's true, but I would slightly disagree with what has been said, because it would mean looking at Syria as a little bit exactly like Libya, thinking that it's a civil war going on in Syria right now. The regime is fighting, for maybe a restoration of power all over Syria, but I think the regime, in a way, has given up many zones and but is looking for its survival. And the Alawites are, the Shiite cults that are associated with the Assad family, which, are about 10% of the population, are very much in danger if the regime collapses, which is totally different than what happened in Libya. Libya was mainly two regions, Benghazi and Tripoli, have different entity, different origin, and a number of tribes, but there was no sectarian violence at that time. And we're looking at a 74% majority of Sunni that is the majority of Syria, and that has been dominated for a long time by a minority, including other elements like Christians and all that. And this is really different. This is something that I don't think that, I think there are certain element of the opposition, once the regime has fallen, who are willing to make them pay for what they've suffered. So we are looking at a civil war. I've looked the civil war from a close when I was covering the Iraq war. This is exactly in some area we're looking at some same pattern. We're looking at radicalization in terms of with hopelessness, like the Sunnis feeling left out are going to turn to more and more radical elements. And the Alawites are fighting for their survival. So at this point, this is really something very murky looking inside. Of course, it has some consequences but it's not a country. It's inter-element that are going at each other at this point. And of course, the Sunnis are ready to use whatever help they're going to get from whoever is outside to help them.
Robert Zarate, it's again a question of put your money where your mouth is. Do France and its allies have the means to handle what would follow military intervention? What Régis Le Sommier was describing, a possibility of an Iraq-like scenario.
France by itself, no. Europe by itself, no. But the United States, Europe, and other members of the responsible international committee, yes, they do have the capability. Now, first, the United States spends upwards of $80 billion on intelligence. And now that almost 2 years have passed since this crisis began, to say that we have no idea who the opposition is, that is a massive failure of intelligence. Second, so long as we stay on the sidelines...
But isn't that the Syrians' fault, not the Americans' fault?
Well, I think there's certainly blame on the United States side. We have formidable intelligence services. We can certainly identify those within the opposition who we can work with and who share moderate values and who aren't wanting to push the country off a sectarian cliff. But more to the point, so long as the West stands on the sidelines, that's not stopping Iran and the IRGC from directly helping the Assad regime. That's not stopping the Russian government from providing arms that risk getting used against the Syrian people. You know, I think it is time to look past the Security Council. My organization, the Foreign Policy Initiative, along with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, led a letter with over 60 Republicans and Democrats urging direct action in Syria, in particular the imposition of no-fly zones in coordination with allies. And I think it's long past due.
All right, last week the French defense minister telling France 24 that a no-fly zone is not on the cards for now, all the while offering himself a bit of wiggle room.
A global no-fly zone over the entire Syrian territory could only be possible if there was an international coalition capable of imposing it. So far, it has not been formed. The theory, on the other hand, of a specific zone on which there would be some kind of exclusion, and that is what Hillary Clinton is talking about, deserves to be examined more closely.
Of course, Luis Peral, on the heels of what Hillary Clinton said, the U.S. Defense Secretary said that a no-fly zone was not, quote, on the front burner.
As I said, it was excluded from very early on, and now there are voices saying that it's time to revise that decision in view of the security problems that are being caused.
When you see how difficult it was in Libya, there were issues of being able to refuel the planes, and as Régis explained, Libya was in a ways a simpler scenario than it was in Syria. Does the West have the backbone for this at this point?
You never know. I mean, of course, countries may say no. They always have other interests or other possibilities to do. But they can try diplomacy once and again. But it's clear that the fact that there was a civil war in the former Yugoslavia didn't prevent the West to lead an intervention in order to protect the victims. I think it's time to focus on the victims, not on the political situation. And of course, there is radicalization taking place in Syria, but this is also a consequence of inaction. If you leave people back to their own fate, they end up asking protection or seeking for protection anywhere they can find it.
So you have to think about what's going to be next. And every time we've heard about who's going to replace the Assad regime if this regime is to fall, there has been no real clear scenario, and no people has been able to step in, being a credible leader to actually take over. We've heard various things, like including former elements of the Ba'athist regime that have defected, that are trying to pull string, and then we have other people that are coming from a bit everywhere. And this form of opposition right now has not proved that it is able to organize itself in order to be credible enough to lead. That's the problem. The main key problem in Syria is what kind of regime do we want, what kind of opposition, what kind of political structure are we going to put in place on this zone? Because what's going to happen, and I'm just finishing on the fact that on what you just said, it's true. Radicalization. These people, if these people give up, if these people are able to win or to defeat the Syrian army and to lead and to go all the way to Damascus, I'm afraid there's going to be another massive bloodshed, and the Alawites are going to be threatened, and it's going to be all over again. And this type of scenario we need to find some sort of solution on that. We need to be working on that, not simply saying, "Oh, Assad must go."
Assad must go is what the French foreign minister said while touring refugee camps in starkly undiplomatic manner.
Mr. Bashar al-Assad does not seem to deserve to live on this planet because he is destroying an entire population.
Does not seem to deserve to live on this planet. We've had panelists last week say that those remarks really are a sign of helplessness. You make tough talk like that when you have no options.
Yes, I do agree, but I think it's important to go back to the core of the discussion tonight. I don't think that an intervention entails regime change. That is what we did wrongly in Libya. An intervention is just to protect the victims, and then in parallel, there should be a diplomatic solution for the situation that takes place in a country. And this is perhaps what we have lost after the situation in Afghanistan, Iraq, and then Libya. That we equal intervention and regime change. But that was not the case in the 90s. The idea was to protect the population. And then, of course, there should be diplomatic initiatives in parallel in order to find the political solution.
When is the last time we actually intervened in order to protect the population without changing the regime?
We did during the 90s.
What example?
The first Gulf War.
First Gulf War, yeah. But Saddam had to withdraw from Kuwait and
that
stay
was absolutely
in his own
a clear-cut situation.
There's a domestic policy question. I'll put it to you, Régis Le Sommier. For people who don't know the intricacies of France, it comes from Twitter. Daniel asks, don't forget the French Foreign Ministry is undertaking much of the work on Syria. Is the Foreign Ministry, the Quai d'Orsay as it's known, driving things rather than the presidential palace? Who's making France's foreign policy now that the socialists are in charge?
Well, again, I would say that's a question of hold-on style. Let's not forget that we come from 5 years of leadership from Nicolas Sarkozy, where everything, including the defense, the foreign affairs, were pretty much duplicated and led from the Élysée Palace. I had the opportunity recently to travel to Afghanistan with Jean-Yves Le Drian, who is the French defense minister. I spent three days with him over there, and not once did he tell me he called Hollande during this trip. He had a roadmap. He had, he was there to actually secure or think about the withdrawal of the French force, which is an important, very crucial element, that's to be put in place. But he didn't call the president. So Hollande is using a much more is trusting much more his minister, including Laurent Fabius on one side or Le Drian on the other side, in order to apply his policy, whereas Sarkozy would focus everything and duplicate them at the Élysée Palace. So it's a different kind of style. It might look on the outside that Hollande is letting Fabius draw whatever he wants, but I don't think it's true. And look at what the Americans are doing. I mean, Hillary Clinton has her own way of saying things, and she's also, she weighs on the U.S. international policy without constantly referring to Obama. We think because we're in France and we're just out of the Sarkozy years, then the president has to say everything or do everything. I think it's changing, and I think it's a good thing.
Another question: this Thursday, France chairing a meeting on Syria's refugees at the United Nations Security Council. Now, France has clout at the United Nations, not just because it's got veto power on the Security Council or because it has the bomb, but just as the UK has the Commonwealth, France brings together former French-speaking colonies in what's called the Francophonie, the organization founded to celebrate and defend the French language, which, by the way, also now includes countries like Ghana. But anyway, the question I have for you, Robert Zorate, when you look at France's, the relationship it has with its former colonies and with French-speaking nations, what's the view you take towards that at places like the UN?
What's the view I take towards France's
to how much clout it has?
I mean, France has some clout. I mean, I'm glad that President Hollande tried to remind the world today that France is a great power. I hope that President Obama pays attention to that and remembers that the United States is a great power and can also affect events not only at the United Nations, but also in Syria. But at the same time, when it comes to Syria, I don't think we should be held hostage by the Russians and the Chinese at the United Nations. It's clear that this is a strategic and moral humanitarian disaster in Syria. And it's long past due for the responsible members of the international community to actually do what needs to be done.
But Robert, you're being very polite here, but I know that in America, people are always accusing the French of boxing above their weight category.
I've spent time in Paris and the French, and I think they've shown leadership. I think under Sarkozy, the French showed leadership in forcing President Obama's hand and beginning what I think has turned out on balance to be a positive intervention in Libya. We've seen the emergence of comparatively moderate government compared to what we see in the Middle East. And I think that the French in the past have shown leadership, and I'm hoping that Hollande tries to match rhetoric with actual realization of the rhetoric.
All right, and before we go, novelist, just so you know, the hot book in France right now, novelist Laurent Binet, he had an inside look at the Hollande on the campaign trail for 6 months. He logged everything, including this quote of the president's partner: "No one can say that they know Hollande, not even me." That's the first lady, Valérie Trierweiler. Luis Peral, the style of the president, as Régis was saying, does matter.
But I would not say anything about French internal politics, but yes, it does, very much so.
But when it comes to Hollande's style on the world stage, and when it comes to handling crises like Syria, his personality, is it a good one to have? Or do you need somebody who sometimes, doesn't wait around for the others and takes a bit more?
I really believe that we need action now. I think it's time to enforce humanitarian action.
So you miss Sarkozy?
Not necessarily, but on international affairs, he was very determined. Clearly so. In Georgia and in other situations, he was very determined.
All right, this is a conversation we'll, of course, continue. Luis Peral, I want to thank you. I want to thank Régis Le Sommier and Robert Zarate, who, for his comments, is always welcome in Paris. We want to thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.
The Week in the Maghreb. Every week, France 24 brings you a roundup of the political, economic, cultural and social news from the Maghreb. The Week in the Maghreb, every Saturday, 6:40 p.m. Paris time on France 24.